Hello and welcome. I'm Richard Crispin, CEO of Collaborate Up and your moderator for the Chiefs Forum. Today, we're going to be having a conversation with chiefs of staff, chief executives, and many other chief executives as we have a conversation about what is going to dominate the next 100 days. The Chiefs Forum, co-hosted by Collaborate Up and the Washington Times and sponsored by Philip Morris International, seeks to put you, our viewers and listeners, inside the minds of the Chiefs and inside the room with them as they think about some of the biggest and most consequential decisions that are going to shape our next 100 days. We want to put you in the Oval Office, in the C-suite, and in the boardroom with them so that you can think like they think, so that you can see what they see and hear what they are hearing. Now, this is not going to be your typical political chat show. No, instead, we're going to have a more nuanced conversation. We're going to leave the vitriol and the partisanship aside, and instead we're going to have a conversation about how decisions are made, how people are thinking about who they're going to talk to, how they're going to engage their stakeholders, and the process that goes into how the work actually gets done. Our session is going to proceed in two parts. Our first panel is going to be with our White House Chiefs of Staff, the relatively small group of people who have actually served in that position for presidents of the United States. And then second, we're going to have a conversation with chief executives from across the civil, private, and public sectors, including chief executives, chief of innovation, chief investment, and other chief X officers. But first, we've got our White House Chiefs of Staff queued up here, and I'm going to dive right in with my first question. And my first question is, what are the issues that they think will shape the next 100 days and why? And I want to turn first to you, Mac McClarty. You are kind of the dean of this club. You, I think, started serving the earliest under President Bill Clinton as White House Chief of Staff, but you've also advised Presidents Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. From your perspective, what's going to dominate the next 100 days, Mac McClarty?
Richard, thank you, first of all, for convening this session. I am delighted. It's always just a great pleasure and privilege to be with fellow chiefs. I think Andy Card is the longest serving chief of staff, so he may arm wrestle me about the dean moniker, but you've assembled a great program, and not only in the private sector, but also focusing on the public sector as well, as you say, the chief office there. And it's good to be with Nick and Josh. I think the first 100 days are always consequential in a liftoff of the president after he or she takes that oath of office. The second 100 days is equally important. I think we'll see a continuation, Richard, of the coronavirus dominating the Biden-Harris administration. I think it's just essential from a health standpoint, a well-being standpoint, and an economic standpoint. I think we saw that the first 100 days. It appears there is a modestly more guarded, favorable trend line here in our country, but still such serious challenges around the world, particularly in India, Brazil, and other countries. I think another key question of the second 100 days, Richard, will be whether or not President Biden can reach out effectively and engage with Republican members of the Senate and the House and achieve some measure of bipartisanship, which he talked about in the campaign, some measure of unity in the country in the infrastructure package. It seems to me he's making a serious effort to do that. I think there is goodwill on the Republican side to engage in that manner. We'll have to see. Thirdly, I think you always have what I refer to as UFOs, unforeseen occurrences. We saw that on the Colonial Pipeline with the disruption of gasoline flow from the East Coast, the midsection of the country to the East Coast. So I think those will be three areas that we'll need to look at going forward, Richard.
Perfect. Thank you. So we've got coronavirus recovery, reaching out across the aisle, especially especially on infrastructure, but also bringing the country together, unifying us, and the unforeseen occurrence. What is going to be that wild card? And so speaking of cards, next, I want to turn to you, Andy Card. You were President George W. Bush's first White House Chief of Staff, but you also bring a perspective as a former cabinet officer, having served as Secretary of Transportation and in the C-suite at General Motors. So what would you add to what Mac just laid out for us?
Well, thank you, Richard, for having me. And I thank Philip Morris for sponsoring this in the Washington Times. It's great to be with Collaborate Up. And I really enjoy to be with the other chiefs of staff and the CEOs that'll be following us. But I feel that you clearly have to pay attention to what's happening in the economy. And we are poised to have, I'm going to say, uninvited consequences to some of the work that's been done to recover from COVID. And one of them may be that people aren't going back to work the way they thought they would. So I think you're going to have to pay attention to the unemployment rate and the job opportunities that can't be filled. And I think it's going to have an impact on our economy. I also worry about the pressure on inflation, in part because the government has been spending so much money, but also because of I'm going to say, the pent-up demand that is challenging the supply chains as we get ready to recover from this challenging pandemic that actually was a challenge for our economy as well. So I would put those two things there. And then you have a world that is not cooperating very well when it comes to even the issues of the pandemic, never mind the challenges in the Middle East going on right now and some of the challenges in China. So there's a lot that the Chief of Staff will be paying attention to in the next 100 days. I think are going to be even more critical to understand the nature of where America is than the first 100 days for President Biden. And so I think that it's critically important that President Biden help find a way to demonstrate to people who are not standing on the fringe, but are kind of standing in the middle saying, help. We want to know that things are going well. Is your leadership strong and steady? Is Congress being invited to participate in finding some of these solutions? But there are real problems and we need to get together to solve them. So I'm calling for people to have the courage to compromise and to meet the obligations together rather than assign them to somebody who is outside of the responsibility.
So I'm hearing themes of dealing with the unforeseen. We heard that from Mac as well. Also around leadership, American leadership. How are we going to lead through and deal with the unforeseen consequences of perhaps a slower return to work, persistent unemployment, increasing pressure on inflation, but also about the lack of international cooperation and bipartisan cooperation on issues that might seem easy to cooperate on, like the pandemic, but also things more complex like China and the Middle East. And how do we really deal with what I would call the movable middle? How do we get that cooperation with the people in the center? Let me turn to you, Josh Bolton. Josh, you were the White House Chief of Staff for George W. Bush and also the head of the Office of Management and Budget, one of the lesser known, but one of the most powerful offices in Washington, D.C. What would you add to Mac and Andy's comments?
Well, first of all, Richard, thank you for having me, Washington Times, all of our hosts, and a privilege to be here with three of my favorite former chiefs. It's a great club, and these are distinguished members of it. Having introduced me as a former budget chief, a distinction that Mick Mulvaney shares, and other chiefs of staff have shared. I should highlight the budget issues as extremely important to the country, but probably little noticed in our politics. It has not been a subject of significant concern for many years, and it may not be for now, but our budget deficit and the piling trillions of debt that is going on as we speak is not at all a problem until it is. And when it is a problem, it will be a massive problem for the United States. When I was first came in as budget director in 2003, when my mentor Andy Card was chief of staff and sent me across West Executive Avenue into exile at OMB, I was petrified because I was being handed a situation in which the budget deficit might exceed $400 billion for the coming year. And I thought for sure the markets were going to punish the treasury bills, the bond markets would melt down, and we would face economic collapse. Today, if you were facing a $400 billion deficit, everybody would be celebrating. And the times have changed. The problem has not. It's just a question of how well we navigate it from here out.
So the budget, I love what you said there. It's not a problem until it is. And it's not been a dominant issue in our politics, but it could become one. And it's sort of this kind of ticking time bomb that many of us are not necessarily keeping our eye on. Mick Mulvaney, I want to pull you in here. As Josh pointed out, you also share the distinction of being a White House chief of staff and a budget chief for President Trump. And you were also in Congress. So you bring the perspective of the Hill. What would you bring to this conversation? What do you think are the issues, and how would you build off what your other chiefs have said?
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for bringing us all together. I can't tell you how helpful these gentlemen were to me. We don't talk about that publicly much, but it was extraordinary to work with each of these gentlemen when I was in the White House. Not surprisingly, one shared OMB director is sort of hard not to be, so I'm going to stay in the fiscal space, but you're absolutely right. I'm going to put a little bit of a congressional hat on, which is to remind people there's really 2 times of year when the really, really nasty stuff gets done. Not surprisingly, it has to do with the vacation calendar in Congress. One of those times is the run up to the time before Christmas, and the other is the run up to the time before the August recess. That falls the next 100 days. What's facing the Biden administration? 2 things I think that bear some, at least elucidation. Number one, they need a spending bill by the end of September in order to keep the government open. Traditionally, that has and will continue to be a challenging time for any administration. Added to that, layered on top of that is that technically, I think the debt ceiling will be breached in July using the extraordinary measures. Treasury should be able to keep things going until generally maybe middle fall, early winter, depending on who you listen to. Always fraught times in Washington, D.C., and things that tend to exacerbate existing difficulties. It's tough to do a spending bill and tough to do a debt ceiling even when folks are getting along, even more so obviously when things are tough in Washington, D.C. So I think the administration, in addition to all the other things the chiefs have rightly mentioned, including those unknown things that Matt McClarty correctly brings attention to, is just this August is a tough time in Washington, D.C. when you're trying to keep the government open. And then when you add a debt ceiling to that, it's going to be very challenging next 100 days.
Terrific. So one of the things I'm hearing from all of you, I kind of want to move us into our next phase of questions here about how you're going to go about, or how you would have gone about thinking through and making decisions with regard to these issues. And you mentioned here, Mick, and several of the others, the calendar and the fact that there's a different pace between how the White House might want to operate and the executive wants to operate and how the legislative wants to operate, and how quickly you can get things done, and how that puts a lot of pressure on the ability to make decisions and to compromise and to work with the other side. So Mick, if maybe I could stick with you because you've served in both branches, how do you think people on the Hill and the White House are going to go about thinking through and making these decisions? Who would you be calling right now? How would you be setting up meetings? What would you be doing?
Yeah, it's talk about the calls you're making, but also the calls you are receiving. Keep in mind, there's a lot of other things that an administration has to be doing in its first 100 days into the second 100 days. I don't think, unless I've missed something in the last couple of days, for example, that the Biden administration has named any of the major ambassadors yet. The phone is ringing with folks who are interested in those positions, interested in knowing other people are getting those positions. There's a lot of pressure inside the West Wing to keep things moving quickly on stuff that doesn't always rise up to make the front page of the paper. And I apologize while an airplane goes over here. So they've got that going. They've got the Senate schedule to deal with. The Senate doesn't like to work. I say that as a proud member of the House of Representatives. And they have other priorities. They have their priorities. So get to the phone calls you'd be making right now if you're in the West Wing. I'd be on the phone, obviously, to the leadership in the House, but to the committee chairman in the Senate and even the rankers in the Senate, to let them know that things are moving quickly, that things are moving smoothly, to let them know that you know what you're doing in the administration, and then encouraging them to take things up as expeditiously as they possibly can. By the way, haven't even mentioned judges or U.S. attorneys or all those other positions that need to get filled. And if they're not filled by summer, sooner or later it becomes a story, and you just don't want that. So there's frenetic activity in the West Wing right now, pushing up against this immovable object on the Hill. But that's no different for this administration than it is for anybody else.
So we've got to deal with appointments. We've got to figure out who's going in which seats on the bus, so to speak. We also have to balance the different schedule that the Senate operates under than everybody else. Andy, I know you were both in the cabinet and as well as serving as White House Chief of Staff. I mean, give us that perspective. You know, as Mick raises the issue of appointments and how do you even decide like who gets to make these decisions and how do you balance between the cabinet, you know, where the cabinet officers get to make versus what other people in the West Wing get to make?
That's the burden that a chief of staff has. Presidential decisions belong to the president. Many government decisions rightfully belong to the people who are in charge of the agencies around government. And in the White House, you have to be careful not to be making government decisions because it takes time to make those decisions, but to know about the decisions. But it's also important that you push decisions down rather than pull them up. So I didn't like it when people were trying to get the president to make government decisions and they were not doing their job. And the president needed time to make the tough presidential decisions that are always the toughest in government.
Can you give us an example? Like what's a presidential decision versus a?
Well, I hope no president made the decision to paint battleships gray, because that's a government decision and it's trillions and trillions of dollars of gray paint. But I hope the president didn't agonize over what color to paint the battleships. So, and most people want the president to make every decision in government so that they can blame the president. The president will own the responsibility, but they truly trust. The C-suite in government is the cabinet, and the cabinet is not really, they don't get to vote on issues and say, Mr. President, you can do that which we vote to do. The president motivates them and their job is to lead, but most presidents do empower their agency heads to make tough decisions within those agencies. And while he's making tough decisions about the peripheral vision that the president has to have, as well as making sure that the tunnel vision is being handled by people who he believes in and will back up. So the chief of staff's job is to manage the calendar and the clock. And one of the great burdens is that everybody wants the president to do everything all the time. And unfortunately, time does not permit the president to do everything. So the chief of staff has to manage the clock. I would say, number one, we got to get an OMB director. There's no OMB director that's been confirmed. And yes, spending is a problem. Paying attention to when the debt ceiling has to be readdressed is a challenge. And there are huge challenges around the budget when it comes to fixing the debt ceiling, because every member of Congress knows that it's a must-pass bill. Nobody wants to vote for it. So they will spend a lot of time trading, and we need an OMB director that is in charge of the trade.
So we have to, the job of the chief of staff is to manage the clock, also to kind of traffic cop which decisions get made by whom, and making sure that decisions aren't landing on the president's desk that really belong on somebody else's desk. Josh, I mean, what's your perspective on this? I mean, I know we need to, Andy referenced the need to bring in an OMB director. How are you setting up things when you were there to manage that clock and to determine and traffic cop those issues and decisions?
Well, I had great examples to follow, not least Andy Card. But I think, Richard, you and Andy put your finger on it. I think that's the most important function of the chief of staff is determining what really is a presidential decision and what should be pushed back down to the agencies. And if it's a presidential decision, making sure that the president hears from everybody who's got a stake in it and gets the best possible advice to make a good decision. That's the chief of staff's job, is enabling the president to make good decisions on truly presidential issues. So you've got to do the sort. Now, one of the things that happens especially in Republican cabinets, where a lot of former CEOs end up in the cabinet, they take these cabinet jobs and they think they're in charge. They're not. They are heads of subsidiaries. There is a CEO of the organization, and it is the President of the United States. And the chief of staff has a difficult job in making sure that all of the subsidiary CEOs, that is the cabinet members, understand that they get to run their business. But when it gets to be an important enough decision, then the decision belongs to the president through a White House process. And That's often a challenge that the chief of staff needs to enforce. And sometimes, as Andy said, the chief of staff needs to push a decision back down to the cabinet officer. More than once, I'm sure my colleagues found this as well. More than once, I found myself saying to a cabinet member, yes, I can get you that meeting with the president, but my advice to him would be that you're taking to him an issue that it is not presidential.
Mm.
He may also conclude that you are wasting his time. Do you want to take the risk of the president concluding that you're wasting his time? And in almost every case, they say, no, I'll take care of it.
Mac, what about you also, I'm sure you dealt with all these issues. What about the other players inside the White House and the executive complex? We've talked about the cabinet officials. We've talked about the relationship with the Hill. What about the office of the First Lady or with others in and around the president and the advisors and the other people that make up the rest of the process?
Richard, you're really drawing out and getting some insightful and depthful commentary from my fellow chiefs, as I would expect to be the case. And what you glean from that is just the enormous amount of activity and work and decisions that have to be made, particularly during the first year of any presidency. And Vic noted about getting a team in place, your government in place. We were very fortunate to have all of our cabinet confirmed by the day after the inauguration, save one position. That is no longer kind of the way of Washington. You've also heard a lot about the budget. You put you identify the right point. I do think President Biden has put together a very coherent, experienced group in the White House in terms of the White House staff. And in most cases, they have worked together both with President Biden and with each other. And that kind of coherence and familiarity, I think, will serve him well. The key coordinating policy agencies or leaders in the White House, as my fellow chiefs know, are the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, which we actually established in the Clinton administration, and kind of combined that with the Domestic Policy Council. Those are three very key positions. But you've also got the Cabinet Secretary, going to Andy's point and Josh's point about cabinet members. And certainly in every presidency, the First Lady is an important office as well as individual and leader. Certainly was with Hillary Clinton in our administration, but you can look at any president, and that is a key office, and that the office of the First Lady must be integrated in the White House activities, Richard. So I think you're identifying exactly the right points. The final thing I would say, Josh or Andy mentioned about, I think Josh did, about CEOs. Having been a CEO of the New York Stock Exchange Company, I think what really struck me, even though I had the privilege to work with other presidents, but not full time, is the speed of decision making in the White House. It is much quicker and faster paced in the public sector in the White House than it is the private sector. Not necessarily legislatively, but the speed of decisions are very demanding, and the breadth of issues, which you're hearing from other chiefs. Mm-hmm. Those are two very, very significant points in my view.
So if we could stick with that, because I want to, because Mick brought this in as well, the issue of time and how time and the calendar can really affect things. You're saying that the decision-making can go quite quickly inside the White House. I don't know that people really associate quickness and our government necessarily in their minds. So really interesting that you're bringing that in. But how do you manage conflict as well when you're under time pressure? So you mentioned several centers of power here: the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, the Cabinet Secretary, the cabinet officials themselves, the First Lady. How do you manage when those are in conflict with one another and you're under time pressure? How do you deal with it? I'll ask you that first, Mac.
Well, that's an inevitable part of the job. It's why the chief of staff job has been referred to as the chief javelin catcher from time to time, and it is. Look, I think the key, and Josh, I think, alluded to it earlier, Richard, I think you have to develop a level of relationship and trust with your colleagues within the White House and within the cabinet and within the Congress. And I think the president and vice president have to feel that the chief of staff and his or her office is an honest broker, that you're going to make certain the president hears all the relevant points of view in an organized, timely, serious, fair-handed manner. Mm-hmm. And once that occurs, if you do the process generally right, and you do the best you can, particularly with time constraints, everybody has been part of the conversation, but then you have to close on decisions. And what I was really referring to, you're right, but in the private sector, you're not under the public scrutiny generally that mm-hmm. you are in the White House. And that's what accelerates that decision process. So I think an honest broker is absolutely key to any chief of staff in his relationships with his colleagues in the White House, the cabinet, and members of Congress.
Mm. Josh, you also brought up this issue of conflict and managing the conflict. What would you add to what Mac just said?
The chief's job is to bring the conflict out, and a counterintuitive element here that I found, and I think most of my fellow chiefs also found, is that on many issues you're managing conflict between different offices, different cabinet departments, and making sure that on a presidential issue, the president is hearing from all the sides, and you're trying to keep people in a place where they're not physically assaulting each other in the meetings that lead up to the presidential meeting. But the counterintuitive element I want to throw in here is that I found myself frequently in the position of trying to provoke conflict among colleagues, because they get into the Oval Office, and I see my fellow chiefs nodding their heads. They get into the Oval Office, and all of a sudden, in the presence of the president, in the hallowed grounds of the Oval Office, things are kind of mellower, and they don't want to put a really tough decision on the president's plate. So they kind of take the edges off their arguments. And the truth is, first of all, no decision gets to the president unless it's pretty hard to begin. It was easy, it doesn't get to the president. And when it's hard, it's important for the president to hear the sharpest version of the disagreeing points of view, and then he gets to make a decision. That's what presidents are there for. I recall once being in the Oval Office with President Bush, George W. Bush, and a fellow came in who was thinking about running for the Republican nomination in 2008. And he was looking for President Bush's advice. And President Bush said, well, I think you probably ought to do it, but tell me something. Do you like to make decisions? And the fellow said, well, yeah. No, he said, do you really like to make decisions? Because that's what this job is. You make hard decisions all day long, and you got to love that. Otherwise, you're not suited to be president.
Mm-hmm. As you said, it's not a presidential decision unless it's a really tough decision. Mick, I saw you nodding your head a lot there. Your thoughts there on how to perhaps provoke conflict, but also manage through conflict?
Yeah, I had to laugh because Josh almost took the words out of my mouth. I actually got a little bit uncomfortable when there was no conflict. But his point about how there might be conflict in the outer oval as you wait to go into the Oval Office to meet the president, but by the time you get in there, all of a sudden people start to go a little bit soft. And I actually remember one time when everybody got in there, they had disagreed fervently. I can't remember the issue. It doesn't make any difference. In the Roosevelt room before we went in, and it sounded like everybody was agreeing. I remember the president turning to me and goes, if everybody agrees, then why are we here? So we tried to encourage dissent. I found that our best decision-making was done when we had vigorous dissent. And some of the things that I think didn't go as we had planned were when we didn't have that level of the other side of the argument. In fact, I saw my job in large part to make sure that the other side of the argument was in the room. I think if you get into a groupthink situation, history has taught that gives us bad results at small levels, at large levels. You can't have everybody agreeing all the time. Number one, that's not a presidential decision if that's the case. And number two, you're probably not getting a good decision. So no, encouraging dissent is almost part of the job as much as time management and everything else.
Mm. So what I'm hearing that as a chief of staff, you have to be yourself comfortable with conflict, as well as provoking that conflict, bringing out the different sides of the argument, and framing something that a president can actually decide. Andy, I'd like to turn to you on this. And what I've heard is like, we have to manage these conflicts. We have to kind of bring the conflicts to a head. But then how do you, once you've made the decision, once the president has made the decision, how do you go about bringing everybody back together again? Particularly if the sharp knives came out.
First of all, the role of a chief of staff who serves at the pleasure of the president is to work every day and not seek that pleasure. So you're actually working against the expectation, because you want the president to be uncomfortable making tough decisions because they're tough. And if an easy decision gets to the president, the chief of staff didn't do their job. The president should make tough decisions. But once a tough decision is made, you are fully on board with that decision. And you don't want any president to make a decision without being optimistic that they made the right decision. It's a brutally tough decision, but they made the right decision. Therefore, the chief of staff's job is to make sure everybody who is obligated to implement that decision understands the president has made the right decision. Now we've got to take it and get it done. And yes, that's the chief of staff's job. But if the president doesn't like his own decision or her own decision, it's very hard to motivate people to implement it. And the White House does not get to implement most decisions a president makes. They're implemented by departments and agencies, and sometimes, a platoon leader. And so, yes, the president has got to be confident in the decisions that are made, and the chief of staff has to take that confidence and try to infect everybody with it, because we want the decision to be implemented to live up to the president's expectation.
So the president, so that's really, I think that's also kind of counterintuitive, that really the key to getting everybody else on board is to make sure that the president himself or herself is really comfortable with the decision itself. That's a great insight. We're coming towards the tail end of our time together, but we still got a few more, about 12 more minutes or so together. I want to ask you guys to think about something. I'm going to come back to you on it. I'd love to hear if you have a story that you think really illustrates either the best parts of being chief or the worst parts of being chief, and that whole decision-making process. But before I get to that, my last question made me think of something, which is that I'm noticing that I think I'd be remiss to not point out that we all look alike on this conversation right now. We are all, I'm of Latino origin, but we're mostly white-looking men on this call. And I looked for somebody who did not look like us as a White House chief of staff, and unfortunately, there haven't been any. What do we do about that? What should be, what should be done to encourage more diversity in that position? And Andy, I'll start with you.
Well, first of all, it's not up to anybody else's call who the chief of staff should be other than the president. If the president is not comfortable with the person, they shouldn't have them as chief of staff. And this is not an election. It's not an audition. And in fact, I learned that if anyone applies to be the chief of staff, chances are they shouldn't be the chief of staff.
Impressive.
I don't know any of us that said, hey, I want to be the chief of staff. No, I was blindsided when the president asked me to be his chief of staff. And I actually challenged him and said, why do you want me to be the chief of staff? Yeah. So, and in terms of, so I'm not, the diversity, the chief of staff shouldn't be hired because of diversity. They should be hired because that's who the president believes can deliver an organization. And the chief of staff's job is to organize the White House and then have a process for decision making and a process for implementation of those decisions. And it's really a dynamic that is crucial to success. And the president should feel very comfortable with the chief of staff, comfortable enough so that they can fire them without feeling guilty. So it's an awkward situation, but I honestly believe that the chief of staff should have a brutally candid relationship with the president and accept I told the president, as soon as I become your chief of staff, I can't be your friend. You're my friend and I don't want to let you down, but you cannot feel bad about being upset with me because I'm your friend. No, I'm in charge of the chairs in the meeting and the information that comes to you. If you're not happy with me, you cannot feel bad about telling me you're not happy with me and saying goodbye. Get out.
Yep.
And I hope that when I leave, you'll treat me as a friend, but you'll be my friend forever. And I won't try not to let you down.
Mac, your thoughts on how to hire a good chief of staff?
Well, I think Andy's comments are very, very thoughtful and on point as usual. I think it is unique to the president. The chief of staff does serve at the pleasure of the president. And I think there's also, Richard, some time element in the presidency that comes into play. For example, in my case, I had certainly not sought the job. I had never worked for Governor Clinton, but there was a familiarity, a trust there that President-elect Clinton felt he needed in his first year or 2 years in office. That changes, I think, over time with the presidency as it does in past presidencies. I think you also have to be politically pretty compatible with the president that you serve. I think you can't be out of step there. I think it almost goes without saying. But at the end of the day, there has to be a measure of real depthful mutual trust and mutual respect. And the chief of staff, in my opinion, has to be comfortable really being very candid with the president, but in an effective manner, in private, in a trustful way. I think that's absolutely essential.
Thank you. Josh, your thoughts, diversity and hiring for the chief position?
Yeah, well, I endorse everything that Andy and Mac just said about the president having to be comfortable. Really comfortable with the chief of staff, and that's probably one reason why we've all been white men in the chief's office, because with one exception, our presidents have been white men, and But I candidly was surprised that President Biden didn't break the string of white men in the chief of staff's office. I thought he was likely to reach out for a woman to fill that role, and I think there were several well-qualified ones who could have. But don't forget, the average longevity of a chief of staff is, I think, 2 years and 4 months, something like that. Maybe
less.
After the Trump administration, Mick, it's gotten lower.
I will point out that Obama had 3.5 in his first term. So we had 4, sort of 3.5. But yeah, you're right. That life expectancy, I think it's about 20 months or something like that.
It's gone below. Okay, thank you, Mick. It's gone below 2 years. So even President Biden, even if he's only a one-term president, is likely to have an opportunity to put a woman or a person of color into that seat and be a good thing.
Excellent. Mick, your thoughts?
Yeah, real quickly, I think it's going to happen soon. It's almost inevitable, and it should be. What you're starting to see, I think it's mostly a function of age than it is gender and race. You've got really good, talented young people now coming up through the system, working through government, working through the private sector, who are going to now start to stand out. We were very close. My chief deputy, Emma King Doyle, was a woman who would make an excellent chief of staff for a future president. Cedric Richmond, an African American young man, is now in the White House with President Biden. So he'd make a good chief of staff. I just think it's one of those things that's changing, and when it changes, it'll never go back. So, and I think that's good and healthy. But I think you'll see those changes coming fairly rapidly.
Terrific. Well, in our last few minutes, I did want to hear your story. Like, give me one story that you think really illustrates either the best parts or the worst parts of being chief, and maybe gives us a takeaway here of what our friends in the audience you should be taking away from our conversation. And Mac, I'm going to go back to you again as I've appointed you as dean.
Richard, a couple of comments. One opening comment, I want to make certain that in this forum that's sponsored by the Washington Times and Philip Morris and others, that we remember that there are key constituencies outside the White House and the Congress. I think it's imperative that the president have a pulse on the American people and engage in that manner, including with governors and local mayors. So I want to make that point up front, if I may, because I think that's important in our discussion. In terms of kind of the high points and the low points, West Wing, the series, the television series, captured that pretty well in their portrayal. What they didn't quite make clear is they had a script and all of us didn't. We were operating without one. That's very different. For me, at least, the high point was when you would engage or have an opportunity to see real people in the real world. And you would have a chance to talk about a policy that you had enacted or supported, whether it be a jobs bill, a family medical leave act, whatever it might be, that had directly impacted the lives of Americans. That to me is where you really get your sense of fulfilling your public service and why it's such a great privilege to be part of a government and part of a White House. The low point to me is when a colleague has done his or her best but has not succeeded, and you have to make a change there in some manner. And usually there's some press surrounded with that. That's always a very difficult personal situation or circumstance. And as all of the chiefs know, because they faced it, I think the most difficult decision is to make a determination to send the brave men and women of our country into harm's way. That's the most sacred responsibility, I think, of any president, is the security and safety of the American people, and that goes with it the commitment of troops when called for.
So the best part is when you get to see how your decisions impact the lives of real people, real Americans. Although there are no fake people or fake Americans either. So it's great. It's great when you get to see people and how they're actually being.
Yeah, that's the real world.
Yeah, but also then the solemn decisions of sending troops into combat and having to decide somebody needs to leave their position. Right. Thank you, Mac. Andy, your thoughts? What's your story?
Very similar to Mac, but I think first of all, it's a great privilege to be part of our democracy, and I want to polish our democracy. And I think presidents have a responsibility to keep our policy process such that the American people know that it's their government. We the people. That's the most important thing for a president to understand. But to help the president carry the burden, I will also say this. I've learned that nobody who runs for office is as smart as they claim to be. Now, Mick is really smart. Josh Bolton's really smart. Mac's really smart. But nobody who runs for public office is as smart as they claim to be. And no one who serves in government is as smart as they need to be sometimes. And we all have an obligation to educate the people who are running for office, serving in office, and working in our government. And unfortunately, if you do that more than 3 times, you're a lobbyist. And that shouldn't be a bad term. It's a great term. I want to make sure people in government are educated every day. And I also, as chief of staff, I loved going to work every day, loved it. And I wanted everybody who worked for the president to really be excited to go to work. But I also, thanks to Josh Bolton, benefited by having Josh tell me every day, thank you very much for today. There may not be a tomorrow, basically. He was basically saying, thank you, it's been great. And when it comes time to say goodbye, it's a tough thing to say goodbye. But it's very important that our democracy be dynamic and people say goodbye when they've worn out their welcome, when they've lost the pleasure, or when they've just run out of ideas.
That reminds me of the line from The Princess Bride. You did a great job today, Wesley. I'll probably kill you in the morning. But very good, very good. So I'm hearing we need to be, if I'm in the audience right now, I should think about how I can educate our leaders and bring those perspectives to them. Mick, your thoughts here, either your story or what's your takeaway from today?
Just real quickly, and Andy hit a nail on the head. I love the job. I had a blast, and I know it doesn't come across that way. And when you look at the world, I guess if there's a lesson to any of this, if you look at the world through the lens of anybody else, I don't care if it's left-wing press, right-wing press, whatever, you're not going to see what the real world is. Real world was we loved our jobs. We really did. And we wanted to make sure the people who were working there love their job. If I have any criticism of any of my predecessors, is what we sort of knew they hated the job, and it's a hard job to do as it is. But you loved it, and I loved every minute of it. I was glad when it was over, but was glad every single day. I don't know if I've got a high point or low point, but I have a story that I think just describes exactly what the job was. It's very brief. I mean, one morning before the president comes down, one of the lawyers walks into the outer oval and says, can I see the president? I'm like, why? So we got a great decision on an immigration case that last night in the Fourth Circuit. I want to tell the president. I said, that's great. Yay, team. Good for us. We put him in a good mood. Great. We go in there. Everybody's happy. The same day, about 8 o'clock at night, my phone rings, and my phone never rang in the office. People would come get me. My phone rings, and it's the same lawyer whose office is right above mine in the Oval Office. I'm like, yeah, and he goes, hey, listen, you going to see the president tonight? I'm like, yeah, I see the president every night. Why are you calling me? Well, we got a really, really bad decision today in the Ninth Circuit on immigration. I'm getting ready to leave town to go to a conference in Chicago. So can you please tell the president the next time you see him? That was the job. And there's a reason that most folks have a limited life expectancy in this position, because you get paid to tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. And if you're doing your job right, you're probably not the most popular person in the building for a long time. But I liked Andy's description about working at the pleasure of the president, but never working to gain the pleasure of the president. I will keep that one forever. Anyway, thanks for having me today. I appreciate it, Richard.
Thanks, Mick. Josh, I'm gonna give the last word to you.
First of all, great pleasure being with these great chiefs, and you, Richard. Thank you. It was a joy to serve as chief of staff, and every chief of staff will joke about the difficulty of the job, but will tell you it was a joy. They won't talk about some of the really trivial, great pleasures of being chief of staff, like getting to go to all the state dinners and things like that. I got to take my mom to the state dinner for Queen Elizabeth. She was my date, and they were exactly the same age. And just to have a lifetime memory for my mom of, being in line with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip was almost worth the price of admission by itself. But there are a lot of other joys. Andy presided over the best event, I think, ever at the White House, when President Bush invited all of the living Hall of Fame baseball players to come to dinner at the White House. And so those of us who got to go to dinner with this in the East Room with all of these Hall of Fame baseball players, that's a lifetime memory. The most important times for me as chief of staff were the time in the early morning. President Bush would get to his desk usually no later than 6:45, and that was the chief's time. Now, when Andy was chief, Andy had already been at the office for an hour and a quarter. Before then, I was just barely getting into the office. But that's when you had a chance to really talk to the president, to see what was on his mind. And those were the important moments. I used to start every day when I worked for Andy, and then when I worked for the president, by thanking them for the privilege of serving, which wasn't trying to butter them up. It was a reminder to me of something that I rarely needed reminding of, which was the privilege of going through those gates every day and being in the White House. And I remember one morning I walked in, and it was a particularly bad day for the president. I think we'd just gotten thumped in the 2006 midterm elections. The war in Iraq was going very badly. And I said, Mr. President, thank you for the privilege of serving even today. And he looked up and he said, especially today.
That's a great poignant moment to leave on our conversation. And gentlemen, I want to really thank you for spending this time with us today. I'm taking away so much from the conversation. I'm going to close our part of it and start to move on to our second panel. So second panelist, if I can ask you to come onto camera and come off mute. White House Chief of Staff, thank you so much. What I'm taking away from this conversation is that the issues that are going to dominate the next 100 days will include the recovery from the coronavirus, looking at how we can reach out and create unity, especially around issues like the infrastructure bill, how American leadership is going to show up in the world as we deal with unforeseen occurrences, both domestically, like the increase and potential increase in inflation, and as well as internationally, continuing to resolve issues around the pandemic, dealing with China, the Middle East, but also thinking about how the budget is going to potentially start to dominate our politics, or may become a dominant issue over the next few days. From a process point of view, I'm listening in, and I think we're going to carry this into our next part of our conversation. Issues around how do you make decisions? Who makes decisions? How do you delegate? How do you deal with time and time pressure? And how do you build trust and manage conflict across a team? White House Chiefs of Staff, thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you with us. Next panel, I'm going to bring up our chief executives and chief innovation officers. Goodbye, White House Chiefs. Thank you so much. And I see our other chiefs have joined with us. And please do come on to camera if you can, please, as we start to move into our next panel. And I see Anmei Chang is with us, Jacek Olczek is with us, and Eric Hargan is with us, and George Allen is with us. Folks, I want to turn to you, and I'm going to put the same question to you that I put to our first panel, which is, what do you think are the issues that are going to dominate the next 100 days? And in particular, I'd love for you to build off of, you can either go deeper on one of the other issues that were discussed, or you can present new issues that you think are going to dominate the next 100 days. And I want to turn first to you, Anmei Chang. Anmei, you and I got to know each other when you were Chief Innovation Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. But before that, you served as Senior Engineering Director at Google. You also served as Chief Innovation Officer for Pete Buttigieg's campaign. And you're also the author of Lean Impact. So when you're give us the perspective from Silicon Valley or from USAID or out on the campaign. What do you think are going to be the dominant issues for the next 100 days?
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would say three things: COVID, COVID, and COVID. Certainly here in the US, we're turning the corner where we're moving into the recovery from COVID, which is also really important. But we can't take our eye off the ball, because COVID is still an issue around the world. And if we don't attend to both the response and the recovery around the world, we may be hit right back again. So, during the course of the pandemic this past year, we had to stay focused here at home. But now that we've had this fortune to begin transitioning back to some semblance of normal life, we can't lose sight of the fact that America's health and prosperity is inextricably linked to the rest of the world. From a health standpoint, estimates are that most developing countries will not have widespread access to COVID-19 vaccines before 2023. That's like 2 years from now. And beyond just the shots themselves, we're already seeing signs of trouble when it comes to distribution, administration, and vaccine hesitancy. So while so much of the world remains vulnerable, we run a serious risk of third, fourth, and fifth waves of the pandemic, which we're seeing all too vividly right now in India. And because we can, as the pandemic continues to surge around the world, it can fuel mutations that evade our growing immunity here in the United States.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Sorry?
No, go ahead. I thought you were done, but go ahead.
So we need to turn our attention more fully to the global response. But beyond the health implications, we also need to contend with the increasingly globalized nature of the socioeconomic toll. Over 100 million more people are estimated to have been pushed into global poverty, into extreme poverty. And beyond our moral obligation to address the suffering, we're already seeing the impact on markets, supply chains, and travel reverberate around the world. So we're also going to need to invest globally to ensure a full recovery. And finally, here at home, we're going to have to confront what looks like, to me, a tale of two cities in our own recovery. Because for the more privileged, while normal life was severely disrupted, many jobs can be done remotely, and those with investments have seen their net worth soar. But for the disadvantaged, many lost jobs and livelihoods. Their children are falling behind in education, and they may even be losing their homes. So this is going to have significant implications for our own recovery, where we must grapple with this divergence of fortunes that's happened in the last year.
So COVID is going to be the dominant issue in your view, and in particular, we need to think about the immediate response, particularly around the distribution, the supply chain, also dealing with hesitancy issues. We've seen people pushed into more extreme poverty globally, as well as here at home. And we've also got these issues of how do we get recovery going until people are healthy and feel comfortable again traveling and meeting and going places. I want to turn, thank you, Anmei. I want to turn now to Indranil Ghosh. Indranil, you're the CEO of Tiger Hill Capital, a leading sustainable investment strategy firm. You were also the head of Mubadala, the Nation of Abu Dhabi's sovereign wealth fund. and you're the author of Powering Prosperity, A Citizen's Guide to Shaping the 21st Century. What do you think? Build off of what Anmay said, also what you heard in our Chiefs of Staff Forum. What do you think are going to be the dominant issues?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show, Richard. I think the first 100 days has been very good for bringing extremely important issues like climate change, like supporting working families, and achieving racial equity to the center stage of the dialogue. And I think that's a really great achievement. But in the next 100 days, I think the attention needs to shift to not just the pandemic, but actually what's the specific policy proposals that are being put forward, how good they're going to be at delivering on these goals that have been set out, and whether they'll help the US to build back better or not. And for me, the key question within that is whether the bulk of the policies will be of the nature of federal tax and spend initiatives that create short-term jobs, yes, by spending money on retrofitting schools and government buildings and fixing roads, which are all very needed, don't get me wrong, or whether the balance will actually tip towards measures where the government is incentivizing the private sector through regulation or various incentives to invest in the key areas like clean infrastructure and healthcare and semiconductors, so that we can build American innovation and leadership in these future industries. I think that is the key for the next 100 days, to see whether the policy detail can give confidence around that.
So we need to see if the policies are going to actually deliver on the promise. Looking beyond the first 100 days, or the next 100 days, rather, looking at will these actually help America build back better? Will some of the needed infrastructure spending perhaps also help to create American leadership into the future and really set us up for the 21st century? Terrific, thank you. Jacek Olczak, you're the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer for Philip Morris International, having previously served as Chief Operating Officer. First, congratulations on your new role. But second, what are the issues that are going to dominate your next 100 days as you're kind of getting settled in? And what do you think is going to dominate the agenda for the world?
Well, thank you for having me here. To be very precise, for me, I have 94 days left to my 100 days, right? About a week ago, I I assumed the role of a CEO of Philip Morris International. I actually have a very interesting recollections. I never was thinking in terms of the next 100 days, because I actually don't understand where the 100 days are coming from. I am thinking next 30, 60, 90 days, because we can very easily convert them into what's going to happen next month, month after, and the following month. And I actually returned from big meetings with all our employees at PMI, and I thought that you cannot leave your people in a vacuum of information, even if you know that you would continue with your strategy, which of our vision, which in our case is to replace all cigarettes in the world with the scientifically proven non-combustible forms of a nicotine. It is worth repeating, because you don't want people to speculate, how far and how much you want to change this direction. So repeating that vision, even if this is obvious, is very important. And obviously, we operate in 180 markets, and I have to admit, in some places, the situation with regards to COVID is getting better. So, some of our, folks can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But if I look into India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Philippines, the world is not really that rosy. So now you need to understand, how do you go and run an organizations which inevitably is taking its, different pace, different speed as we unfold from a crisis. I believe it's very important for all of us that nobody is left behind. Because if you think, we're living in the global connected world, whether we like it or we don't like it, but I think altogether we have actually benefited from the fact that, we more or less, participate in this global economy in a positive sense of this word. And I think would be very important, and we'll recover from this COVID more or less in the same time. And if I see what is happening, on occasions with, the vaccine distributions, how different
problems are being solved. I think it's very important not to leave everyone behind, because this will backfire on all of us later on. This is a mobility crisis, and the thinking that the one country, when it can regain its mobility, in a sense that, I can go to work, I can continue my daily routine, but I cannot go abroad. I cannot, entertain the meeting with my colleagues abroad. I cannot go for a vacation. I cannot see my family abroad. I will very soon realize that everyone has to recover. Otherwise, we'll never go back even close to what we used to have before. So no, I am born optimist. I believe it's going to happen, but we have to be very, very careful. So I'm, very happy that I passed my first 6 days in PMI, reconfirmed the visions. We go smoke-free. Vision was the right strategy. Is okay. You always can find a better way of executing and accelerate the path to achieve that vision. But, it's effort worth taking. And I also realize one thing, that, in a business, you have this, a theory, it's not a theory actually, but the concept of the black swans, that from time to time you see the black swan, and this is this event which surprise everyone, etc. And I have to admit that the number of black swans I've seen over the last 18 months is, frankly speaking, worrying. I wonder when was the last white swan I have seen recently, because I see a Suez Canal, I see a COVID, I see a shortage of CPUs. You have a number of the things which theoretically shouldn't have happened, and all of a sudden everything is happening. So it's getting a little bit worried how many black swans are still in front of us.
Right. So your first job as a CEO is to get out and reiterate the vision and make sure that people understand that you're staying the course, and that your commitment to ending combustible cigarettes remains your commitment. But you're also seeing worrying signs, because if it's an uneven opening, if it's an uneven recovery, it's not really a recovery for any of us. And there's these black swans are coming faster and more furious at us. Eric Hargan, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You were Deputy Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. You also served as Acting Secretary and as the department's Chief Regulatory Officer. Most people probably don't realize HHS is the biggest agency in the government by budget. What are you seeing? What would you have been thinking when you were in the chair, and what are you seeing right now?
Sure. By the way, it's an honor to be here, and actually an honor to have served both the Bush and the Trump administration under 3 of the 4 chiefs that you had in the first part of the program. So good to see them again. I'm going to echo what was said before. Obviously, me coming from the healthcare sector, you see the wind down of the pandemic is really going to be the story of the next 100 days, I believe. And I hope that as we move forward, what is being done is we get the lessons learned, the positive sides that we've seen, at least in the sector, things like the rise of telehealth, a lot of innovation that happened. I was in the board of Operation Warp Speed. We do not want to lose what we learned in the public sector and in the ability to collaborate with the private sector in such an effective way. And I think that these things, and as the attention inevitably shifts, I think, out of the United States in many ways into the international arena with the pandemic, because what has been done here and in a number of other countries has been is, I think, going to effectively quell the pandemic in large part. It's already happening here. Inevitably, the attention is going to shift overseas, even inside the United States. But I think the important thing is to figure out what positive we can take away from this, and to build upon it so that we can never, frankly, have to go through this again.
Excellent. So we have to figure out, how do we continue the public-private collaboration? How do we encourage innovation? How do we, as we turn our sights to what's over the horizon and what's coming, what's happening internationally, how do we make sure that we can deal with those issues and hopefully improve the ability for everyone to recover, but also take away some positives from this pandemic? That's fantastic. Lastly, George Allen, I want to bring you in. You were the Commonwealth of Virginia's 67th governor and a senator. Now, I know we're in the midst of election cycle in Virginia, and I know the Republicans just picked their nominee for governor, but I want to steer clear of the politics of that race. And instead, I want to ask you about a kind of a unique thing in Virginia. I don't know if it's unique, but I know it's very rare, in that the chief executive, the governor, can't run for re-election in successive terms. So you've lived through exactly what Governor Northam has lived through. the 100 days of this next 100 days where you're not seeking reelection. How would you be approaching these issues? What do you think are going to be the issues that are going to dominate for Governor Northam? But how would you be dealing with the kinds of issues that might cement your legacy? Who are you calling? How are you reaching across the aisle? And how are you working with your fellow governors right now?
Well, the last year, you're always working for the people, and you're trying to keep the promises you made to the people when they gave you the honor and responsibility of serving. Listening to Mac McLarty and the other chiefs reminded me that in every one of my cabinet secretaries' rooms, we had a picture of horses running across the open plains, rangeland, and said, you either make dust or eat dust. And we wanted to lead. And we started off at a full gallop with a loose cinch, and you don't have a lot of time. In fact, I think good executives, at least at the state level, what I did is we went through a whole list of all the promises I made. And then we decided what years we wanted to get things done. What did we want to get done and focus on year 1, year 2, year 3. We did not have anything for year 4. So year 4 was going to be keep fighting for the priorities that didn't get done in year 1, 2, 3, or 4. So you still can get things done. You still can help people in improving their lives. We had a cabinet, and it was listening to the chiefs. I wanted a cabinet of people who knew more than I did, or more knowledgeable than I was in their areas. Like Rob Martinez knew more about transportation and infrastructure than I did. I had a great Secretary of Commerce and Trade. Kay James was perfect for welfare reform, having grown up on welfare and transitioning to the idea of independence. So you can keep doing things till the last moment. The Virginia governors accorded a lot of responsibility to get things done. And you're heck, to the very last day, I was making announcements of Geico or some other company, making an investment in Virginia and creating jobs, which I'll say that, the best social program of all is a job. And so you still wanted to do all our regulatory reforms and make sure Virginia is the best place for people to invest, create jobs, learn, and raise their families. Part of it is you also want to celebrate your successes and cement those successes and those legacies that they don't go away as soon as you leave. And so many of the things we did, whether it's truth in sentencing, which has made Virginia the safest state, the lowest repeat offender rate of any state in the country, 3rd or 4th lowest violent crime rate, the welfare reforms, the high academic standards, school performance report cards, all of those are still there. Now they're under threat, but they have survived Republican and Democratic governors in subsequent years. So you do want to cement those legacies and have the people understand why that actually matters to them in their lives, not just theoretically, but personally.
So I'm hearing a couple of things there, a couple of themes that I think we can pull into the next part of our conversation, where I really want to focus on how you go about making these kinds of decisions, how you engage stakeholders, and how the theoretical sausage gets made here. What I'm hearing from you, Governor, and what I've heard from others, and we also heard from our chiefs, was the importance of who you're hiring, who you're putting in these different roles, how you set the calendar out and the priorities that you're going to try to achieve over your time in office, and when you're starting to tackle different things. And Janelle, I'd like to get your perspective as an investment officer, as a chief executive yourself. How are you going to think about the next 100 days? What are the kinds of decisions? How do you set up an investment portfolio to think about maximizing return, a sustainable return in the face of all of these new black swans that are coming at us, as we heard from Yasin?
Look, it's a very difficult time, but it's also a time where there's an incredible opportunity, because I think I would be looking for companies and actually states, regional governments who are setting themselves up to be, the leaders in a sustainable future. Because especially with the demographic trends, with younger people, believing increasingly and wanting to, see regulation and practices that promote sustainability, it's a trend that's going to happen sooner versus later. So, companies that are setting out their stall now, states that are setting out their stall now to compete effectively in that future are the ones to be looking at, and there will be a competition. Now, I give an example, like, possible legislation around the clean electricity standard, right? That would require all electrical power production to be from renewables by 2035. And also grants and incentives announced to potentially help the building out of a network of electrical charging stations for EV vehicles. These are, big pieces of legislation that create opportunities for all sorts of industries like geothermal and biofuels and energy storage, agricultural products that are more sustainable. And the companies that are setting up their stall now to take advantage of these opportunities are the ones that are going to be, the champions of the future. If you look at what's happened over the last 10 years, companies like NextEra Energy that invested early into wind and solar are now more valuable than the ExxonMobil, which didn't put enough measures in place to be part of that transition. The next 10 years, starting with the next 100 days, are all about how we get ready for that second wave of this sort of transition to the new green economy. And as an investor, I'm looking for the companies and the states and the local governments that are getting ahead of that curve and competing for the capital, competing for the talent, competing for the new opportunities ahead of their competitors.
So you're looking for the jurisdictions, the states, the localities, the nations, as well as the companies that are setting themselves up for success in this newly changed environment, both to deal with perhaps changes in regulation, but also to deal with changing in consumer attitudes and the black swans and the unforeseen events that might be coming our way. Jacek, I'd like to pull you in. I know Philip Morris International, you're trying to essentially reposition the company in some of the ways that Indranil just said, to try to take advantage of changes in consumer preference and also through the introduction of new products that would essentially end combustible cigarettes. So tell us, how are you thinking about how you're positioning the company, and what are the steps you're going to take over the next 100 days to build trust and to build confidence?
Well, 6 years ago, when we started our transformations, all our revenues were coming from cigarettes as we know them, right? And from the combustible products. I mean, last year, 5 years in a transformation, 6 years in a transformations, quarter of our revenue is already coming from the non-combustible. I repeat again, scientifically substantiated alternatives to smoking. Now, we set a very ambitious target, objective, but I believe is attainable, that by 2025, more than 50% of our revenue should come through that alternatives. And in addition to that, I think we should be in a position to generate the first $1 billion coming from the products which have nothing to do with the tobacco and nicotine. Because I believe the capability which we have built on the scientific sides, on the clinical assessment, clinical development, can help us to pivot also part of our business into this territory. I mean, a few people only know that we have already some years ago invested, for example, in the startup in Canada, which today is on the last days of a third stage clinical studies on the COVID-19 vaccine, which is produced based on the plant, that plant happened to be a tobacco related or coming from the tobacco varieties plant. And this is where we shared with this company of the knowledge which we brought to this business is our knowledge of agriculture and the knowing the genome of the plant, etc. So it's a number of the capabilities which we have built while developing better alternatives to smoking, which I believe can serve the company beyond the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and all the results is going to be a more sustainable business. So the transformation, I guess, will never happen. I personally start hating almost the word of a transformation because it gives you the expectations. You start something on Monday and by next Wednesday you're over. You will never be over, because if you have a creativity, innovations, and a great people around you, you can now start going and moving the company into the territories nobody ever heard about. I think there will come a day I will have to remind people that Philip Morris used to be a company which was selling cigarettes. And I think it's actually closer, and the faster this may happen that many people can suspect. So this is where we are.
So it's not a defined start and stop to a process, but really a very long journey. And what I'm hearing you say is that you're kind of assessing what are the assets that the company has, how can we bring those assets to improve our understanding of science, and also how those products and services can help to do other things that aren't related to tobacco and aren't related to combustible cigarettes, and looking towards a future when Philip Morris International is no longer in that business. Anmei, I want to bring you in here. Eric brought up the issue of innovation and continuing innovation, and how do we make sure that we harness American innovation for the benefit of the world, and how we're going to do that both for America as well as for getting to this future that Jacek talked about of not having an uneven recovery. So as a chief innovation officer, how do you see the role of innovation?
Well, I think that one of the biggest mistakes we make in government is that we treat most activities as if we're procuring a tank. That is, we think we know exactly what we want and that it's a matter of pure execution. Now, when we have a proven solution to an understood problem, this can work reasonably well. For the most part, the bureaucracy is set up to ensure fair procurements, compliance to regulations, and that our precious tax dollars aren't wasted. But in the situations where our solutions are woefully insufficient or where the problem has shifted dramatically, these same systems stifle the risk-taking, the agility, and the innovation that we need to succeed. And of course, this pandemic is unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. So we need to approach this with humility and focus our efforts not only on implementing solutions, but also finding solutions. In the private sector, Bain described this distinction as an engine one, which is the core business or things we know how to do well already, and an engine two, or growth or innovation engine. And what the government has not figured out how to do as well and is starting to make strides towards is developing that engine two. And I think this current situation is going to force us to do so. And I think a similar framework could be used where we identify where innovation is needed. And then engage stakeholders in new ways, as Indranil described, as problem solvers, as co-creators, as innovators, where we incentivize the innovation that we need to solve the problems we don't yet have solutions for. We just saw a great example of this with the breathtaking speed at which vaccines were designed and tested and distributed through this collaboration between the public and the private sector. And we can learn from that. And recognize that many elements of our recovery are equally ambitious and are going to require creative solutions. And this is going to look different. It's going to be a different way for government to work that can be unfamiliar. And I'd suggest three things. One is stop picking winners too soon. We need to let 1,000 flowers bloom by embracing smart risk-taking and experimenting with a lot of different approaches to figure out what's going to work best. To do so, the second is we need to build in the agility to learn and adapt as the knowledge and the context changes for these problems. And third, we need to measure success, not solely based on the activities that are being performed, but also on the outcomes and the results. And like I said, this is going to be a very different way that government needs to work more and more as we encounter, just these unprecedented challenges in front of us.
Terrific. I love that distinction between it takes a different set of processes to find the innovation versus implementing the innovation, that engine one, that engine two. I know you mentioned Bain. I know Clayton Christensen has also written a lot about this around the innovator's dilemma, and that sometimes the processes that we use to implement things actually crush the innovations that we're trying to bring out. I think that's a great segue to bring back in Eric. Eric, you were in the room for Warp Speed. Give us that perspective, like how reflect on what Anmei just said about the difference between finding and implementing, and how that kind of worked, or what happened there, and her three takeaways about not picking winners too soon, and having the ability to learn and adapt and to measure outcomes.
Well, I mean, that was the essence. I mean, I was on the board there in the leadership in Warp Speed, and that was important that we had over 100 vaccine candidates to start off with, that the clinical group could go through to get it down to 14, then 7, then 6 finally. And we had a number of options available and really new technologies, which had turned out to be successful and bring a much sooner end to this pandemic than we could have otherwise hoped in that area. But some of that probably we engaged with the private sector. We could have done it even faster, to be honest. But a lot of this was having to kind of create on the fly. In many ways, around the government, around eliminating as much bureaucracy as we could, things that really didn't need to be in place that we could innovate around in terms of, sort of prepaying, promising ahead of time, de-risking a lot of the endeavor of finding the vaccines and the therapeutics. These were important. They were there. it was all legal, but it hadn't been thought through. And now, hopefully, those tracks have been laid and people will understand in the future how to do it. I think one of the important things here, though, is for us to think through in the future, and I think this very much goes off her point, is about the distinction we saw between, or I saw between, the medical science and technology on the one hand, and then how it has been perceived and implemented. So the distinction between medical science and technology on the one hand, and public health infrastructure on the other, the messaging, how things are perceived, and how we deal with the appetite in the public for these very definitive and immediate answers to things that often do not have immediate and definitive answers right away. It's a balance between the scientific endeavor and the need for public policy and for answers to the public and guidance to them on what they should do. I haven't come to a conclusion about this. I'm not sure there is a conclusion about this at this time, but I think it's important for us to continue sort of really thinking this through.
But if I could press you on that point for a second, because one of the things we heard from the chiefs of staff was that oftentimes their job was to bring the conflicts to a head and to cause the decision to be made. You're highlighting there that many of these issues hadn't been thought through. How did you get them to be thought through? How did you get them to be framed? And not necessarily you personally, but the warp speed process. Like how did that result in that different thinking?
Sure. Well, you brought together leadership from a number of different areas across the government. So there was HHS, there was Homeland Security, there was Department of Defense. A lot of people brought together, a lot of scientists, a lot of leaders that were brought together in the room to think through these things, whether they were lawyers, contracting officers, scientists, manufacturing experts, distribution experts. We had to bring as many voices as possible into the room. There was simply no way to solve this problem with an existing small group of people. You had to bring more voices, you had to bring more perspectives into it. And that's how ultimately, in my opinion, it was successful, because you had different groups of people who had different expertises. They all came back to leadership, in other words, to the leaders of the Warp Speed project. But while they were away, they were doing what they were best at doing. And so it did not turn into a single group of people, whether at HHS or otherwise, who was solving the problem. But we essentially decentralized a lot of the decision-making into other groups, companies, departments, and so on, who could each take advantage of their own expertise, their own particular excellences to solve this problem. I think if we had tried to maintain a choke point and a single decision-making place, it ultimately would have failed. If we'd placed our bets only on one vaccine or one therapeutic or things like that, it would have ultimately failed if we'd chosen a national champion or something like that. I'm glad we didn't do that. We had the resources to do it. Thank goodness for the taxpayers.
Anmei, what did you think? How does that kind of accord with what you were just saying in terms of the process?
I couldn't agree more. I think that that's absolutely true. And I think my point was that we should take the lessons from that, not only for developing the next vaccine or the next big picture breakthrough, but also for the recovery, because there's many unknowns in the recovery. We can't just think that we can pick an answer and then execute on that answer. I think we need to take that same spirit of, trying a lot of different things, really iterating, really driving for better results, and apply that to the recovery as well.
Governor, I want to bring you in. Again, as a governor, you have to balance so many different constituencies. You've got the state government itself. You've got all the different localities, and I know the way that localities work with Richmond is kind of different in Virginia than it is in some other states. You're also working with your neighboring states and your fellow governors and with the federal government. When you reflect on both what Indranil said in terms of placing bets on the jurisdictions that are preparing best for the world to come, and also on Anmei and Eric's and Jacek's reflections here about setting us up to really unleash innovation. How do you see the role of the governor in doing that?
Well, a great deal in it. And I really enjoyed listening to everyone's comments because you do have to be willing to adapt, change, innovate, and improve. And if you don't, you'll be left behind. And clearly there's competition between the states. In fact, to the credit of President Trump, and I think it's probably going to stay on, a lot of this COVID response has been left to the states. And then within the states, I think even regions or zip codes or counties and cities ought to be treated differently. The densely populated places where they have mass transit may have greater problems than folks out in the country. And we've seen that. So the competition between the states has always existed. There's the laboratories of innovation, the laboratories of democracy, and it's pretty clear who's winning and who's losing. There are rich states and there's poor states. And states like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and now even California are losing population. The best states for business from Chief Executive Magazine, traditionally, consistently, year after year in order, are number 1, Texas, number 2, Florida, number 3, Tennessee, number 4, North Carolina. And then out west, states like Nevada and Arizona are doing very well. Now, what are the commonalities? They have comparatively lower taxes or no state income taxes. They have prompt permitting. They have affordable energy, which matters for manufacturing and data centers and everything else. They have right to work laws where people are not forced to pay union dues as a condition of work. And then the other key is a skilled workforce from which to draw employees. And so the states that have that are the ones that are going to win in the future. I don't like the idea of a government directed economy. I think free people in the free market ought to determine the winners or losers. This infrastructure bill, to the extent that there's agreement on it, will be on real infrastructure. And part of that will be broadband, which is important for connectivity. It's as important as electrification was with the TVA and rural co-ops 80 years ago. But to the extent it is this Green New Deal idea, I don't think that's going to get very far because generally speaking, it's regressive. It increases the cost of electricity, fuel, gasoline, and food for lower income families. So there'll probably be a divergence on that. But I think that the states, and in fact, the way the states like Texas and Georgia and Tennessee and Florida and South Dakota, they've been open. And in Virginia,
what would you be doing right now to encourage greater cooperation and innovation within the different parts of the state? But within
here's what I did. I would have followed the policies. I commend the policies of the governors of Texas and Tennessee and Florida. They didn't lock down folks. There's no reason to have these mask mandates.
I want to stay away from the politics of it.
Here's the big thing that can be done. We are vulnerable as a country to pharmaceutical agents, ingredients that are manufactured in China and some places that are not reliable. And BARDA, Eric, you all with BARDA and so forth, we need to have these pharmaceutical agents, active pharmaceutical ingredients. We need to have those manufactured here in the United States of America, or at least from allies that are reliable. That's important for our national health security rather than being vulnerable to countries that are, let's say, unreliable or certainly some adverse to us. And I think that's vitally important, and that's jobs, but that means you have a culture of investment, long-term research and development, like the National Nanotechnology Initiative and others that are so important for the private sector to actually develop these medicines or devices for future health and security.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from all of you is that we need to have an innovation culture that encourages, doesn't pick winners too early, where markets and 1,000 flowers are allowed to bloom, so we can see how these innovations are going to play out. We need the ability to learn and adapt and measure success based on outcomes. I'm also hearing we need to have a clear focus on supply chain security and making sure that we understand where things are coming from and that we know how to balance our supply chain needs. And that we have a focus on reopening all of the economy, not just the United States, not just individual localities, but really getting everybody back into prosperity so that we can continue to grow. And we need to have a way within our organizations for balancing different risks, in particular unintended or unforeseen risks, and acknowledge that while we are as companies or as organizations, we are competing, we're also competing as jurisdictions to get ourselves positioned for the future. We're winding up on our time here, but in the last 2 minutes that we've got here, I'd love to hear one takeaway from each of you, one thing that you think people in the audience can go and do, or one big learning you think they should take away from this conversation, both our conversation now as well as our conversations with the White House chiefs. And Governor, since I've got you, what would be your one takeaway?
I think people listening, make sure your voices are heard by those who are making decisions. The people are the owners of the government. So whether it's your local government, state government, or those at the federal level, whether you're an association, whatever it may be, make sure that your personal stories, your voices are being heard. And that will help those making decisions make better decisions.
Get your voice heard, help people make better decisions. Eric Hargan, your thoughts?
My takeaway would be, just from recent history, the ability of this country and its innovators are staggering, and it is the jewel in this country that has saved us this time from much human suffering. It's something that we need to protect and elevate in the country as we move forward. Make sure that we learn the lessons we just went through.
Learn the lessons. Make sure the innovation continues. It's the jewel in the crown. Jacek, your takeaway.
I think the times when the one party, one person, while the agency thinks that they can solve the problem and offer the silver bullet are gone. We're living in the times when you need the full collaborations, left, right, center, middle, all agencies, industries, regulators, in order to solve the mounting problems which are in front of us.
Collective action is needed to solve our problems. We need to come together and work together. Indranil Ghosh, your one takeaway.
I think we all need to be prepared to embrace very rapid change, because these black swans are probably going to become more the norm than the exception. But they're also moments of huge opportunity. If you look back at this last pandemic, who would have thought a year ago that we would have moved so far in things like remote working, moving out to different parts of the country, alleviating pressure on cities because we can do that now, to telehealth and all of the other amazing innovations that we've been forced into. And as part of embracing change is that collaborative spirit. The public and private partnership, public and private capital need to come together to inject capital resources and talent into those opportunities.
Big challenges, but big opportunities. Be prepared to adapt and strike when the iron is hot. Anmay, I put you on the spot to start, so I'm going to give you the last word. Your final thought.
I would say we've appropriated an unprecedented amount of money for the COVID response and recovery as a government. And it's an opportunity for us to show that government can be an incredible force for good. But to do that, we're going to have to not only get excited about the number of dollars and the areas that we're spending them on, but also look at how we're doing that. And that is going to require us to modernize government to make it fit for purpose for the 21st century problems that we're facing these days.
Well, Anmay, Eric, Indranil, Jacek, Governor Allen, I really want to thank all of you for taking your time today. I also want to thank all of our White House chiefs of staff for joining us. This has been such a fantastic conversation. I hope you and the audience got as much out of it as I did. I want to again thank our sponsors, Philip Morris International, and our co-hosts, the Washington Times and Collaborate Up, for making this conversation possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the Chiefs Forum. We'll see you next time.